A couple weeks ago, I heard the most fascinating story. It was a story of a mother and father who had encountered an unbelievable challenge in the light of their story of life. And the story unfolded that one of their children had veered in a different path. And as a result of that, they just determined they would just pray, believe, trust that God would ultimately come through and touch the heart of that daughter. And it was interesting because 18 years passed. For 18 years, they prayed, they believed, they trusted. They encountered the Lord, said, I'm going to trust you. And out of that patience, they began to see the fruit of that, and God began to do something amazing. And what you discover in life is this. If you're willing to wait and watch, instead of waiting and wondering, you can have the most amazing life. Because what happens in all of us, we're all in pursuit of wanting to see something that only God can do. And today we look at what happens as we get ready to wrap up the book of James. We wrap together these thoughts that he gives about how important it is that we're ready to wait. All right? And so if you're like me, waiting is not my favorite subject. In fact, today coming to church, I was thinking about the message, and I got stuck at the light at Medlock and Peachtree Industrial. And I just sat there, and I thought nobody was coming either direction, but I was like, why am I waiting? And I was watching these other cars. They'd come to the right, and they turn right, go down Peachtree Industrial. I thought to myself, if I'd go right here, I could go left by Napa, I could be at the church. But I just sat there to see if I could wait and be patient. You think I could? Absolutely not. It was frustrating to me. But reality is that waiting is never easy. Waiting is a part of our journey of life. And when you start thinking about it, if you begin to ask yourself a question, have you ever been impatient in life? Have you ever got out of sync because you started thinking about something and you thought, man, if I could just see that happen, if that would just transpire in this way. And it's interesting, by the way, he has a beautiful life plan for all of us, but we have to be willing to wait. We have to be willing to surrender our agenda to God's timing, God's plan, God's purpose for our life. And it's not always easy. And learning to wait is the wisest choice we could ever make, because out of that, you discover the true adventure of life. And what we're going to look at today is what happens when someone learns that the adventure of life is perfectly planned by God who loves them beyond what they can imagine, and out of that love comes something amazing inside of your heart and mind, and we come to a place where we discover that waiting is always wise, because in his timing, God will show us exactly what he wants to show us. So today, I want us to kind of glance at a few verses that are throughout the Bible before we get into James chapter 5. This week and next week, we'll look at what happens as James concludes his letter that he wrote to a bunch of people, that he tried to encourage them in the midst of their journey. And that's why our theme verse out of this is chapter 1, verse 12. Blessed the man who persevered under trial, because once he has endured, he will receive the crown of life. So today we dive into what happens when someone misunderstands what's been entrusted to them, and then what happens when someone is willing to wait. All right, so we see it's really cool how these examples he gives. I hope they will be helpful to you. And also I hope that it puts your faith on a journey of realizing that waiting on him always leads you the right way. Psalm 27, verse 14 says this, wait for the Lord. Be strong. Let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. So if it's good for David, it's probably good for us as well, learning to wait. Isaiah 40, verse 31 says this, yet those who wait for the Lord will gain new strength. They'll mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They'll come to a place where they will walk and not become weary. Psalm 130, verse 5 says this, I will wait for the Lord. My soul does wait, and in his word do I hope. All right, so then we find us in James chapter 1, verse 12, the verse I quoted to you a moment ago. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial. In other words, perseverance is paying a price worthy of whatever it is you're encountering, whatever it is you're facing. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because the one who's been approved, once he's been approved, in other words, the Lord says, you know what, you got it, you figured it out, now move forward. He'll receive the crown of life. And the crown of life, the Lord has promised to those who love him. All right? So today we get into James chapter 5. In verses 7 and 8, we find the verses about how the farmer works in the journey. All right? Notice what it says in verse 7. Therefore be patient, brethren. Be patient until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil. Why? Because being patient about it until it gets early and late rains, you too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. All right? So what he says is this idea of patience, in other words, enduring, persevering, it's all built into the theme of the entire book of James. All right? So if you have been reading along with us in the book of James, you begin to realize something. That here's James instructing a group of people, and what their instructions all linked to is them coming to a place where they know how to control their tongue, they know how to wait when they need to wait, they know how to persevere when trials are coming, they know how to face life the way God intended. And what you discover is the Bible is full of all those kind of illustrations all the time. How do we learn how to live in such a way that we fulfill what God has intended for our life? And today you're going to see this in a unique way because the contrast that he gives us is profound. The contrast is the person who's been entrusted with a lot but misunderstands why he was entrusted with it, and the farmer and Job and the prophets, all of which had to wait, all right? And so you're going to see this, and I want to show you something, even when it looks at, and we look at the book of Job, how this unfolds just for a moment in each one of our hearts and minds. So today, as you think about it, what does Jesus do? Jesus becomes real to us as we place our faith and our trust in him, and we begin to surrender ourselves over to him, all right? And that surrender allows us to become more patient versus impatient. In other words, we come to a place where, you know what? I don't have to have all the answers. I just need to know who the answer is. Or I come to a place where I go, okay, I'm not going to allow this to steal the direction or the hope of what God has for me. And here's what you realize. A Jesus-centered life is always willing to wait on a Jesus-provided answer. You just have to be willing to wait. All right? So, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 5, let's look at this text and let's just kind of see, how it unfolds, because you're going to discover that as you look at it, you're going to begin to see something. You begin to see that as he concludes his letter, we're going to come to the place, by the way, next week, where you arrive at a verse where it says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. All right? So, what does James conclude his thoughts with? Prayer is the key to everything we do. And it's interesting. It's not long, drawn-out prayers that no one can keep up with. It's a simple prayer. It's a simple prayer of saying, Lord, I want you to do what only you can do. I want you to speak to my heart. I want you to awaken me to what it is you want to do inside of me. And what happens is as you start living that way, all of a sudden your life becomes Jesus-centered, and that central theme of thought that becomes a part of your story helps you become effective. So today we're going to look at two different kinds of men and women. The wicked man, riches, and how he approached life. And then we're going to see what happens when the wise man, the man who has wisdom, begins to stay faithful in making his choices. All right? So today we'll contrast those two things. And what you'll see is that James uses very definitive words to describe the person who misunderstands one of the key concepts of the Bible, and that is, what's entrusted to us is entrusted for us to steward, not to own. In other words, what's given to us is not something we hang on to. We can't take it with it. Instead, it's something that we should steward, and steward in a way that's powerful. So look, if you would, James chapter 5, beginning in verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries which are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments have become moth-eaten. Your gold and your silver have rusted, and the rust will be a witness against you, and will consume your flesh like fire. It is in the last days that they have stored up your treasures for you. Excuse me one moment. Anyone else get hit by the pollen? Wow, it's attacks. But I'm going to be all right. One more secret here. My Romanian secret, all right? Don't look at what it is, all right? I actually have no idea what it is. I just know that it works, so I'm thankful for it. Now, look on with me if you would. Verse 4, behold, the pay of the laborers who mowed your field, which has been withheld by you, cries out against you, and the outcry of those who did the harvesting has reached the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath. You have lived luxuriously on the earth and led a life of wanton pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and put to death the righteous man. He does not resist you. All right, now, You read those verses, here's what you discover. James didn't care too much for someone who misunderstood what had been entrusted to him. James had a real perspective about it, which basically said, you're going to pay the price for this, and you're going to pay for it in all kinds of different ways. In fact, when you look at these verses, you'll notice he uses some unique words. Notice, if you would, in verse 5, that you've led a life of wanton pleasure. All right? That's rebellion. All right? What he's saying, you've rebelled against what God had for you, and as a result, your rebellious choices have been to your detriment and to your the displeasure of the Lord. All right? So here's what's interesting. When you look at this, you realize that James is saying everybody has an opportunity to steward what God gives them. And it's not, and he's not talking about just about money here, he's talking about life. We steward the lives God's given us so that we see the opportunity to honor him with whatever it is he entrusts to us. So the couple things that are really important. First thing is this. The sacred trust of blessings requires wisdom and obedience. In other words, if God chooses to bless you, if God chooses to entrust something to you, if he gives something to you as a result of his choice for your life, that choice, that blessing, you have to see it as a sacred trust. In other words, God looks at you and says, you know what, I believe I can trust him or her. He looks at you and says, I think I can trust her, or I think I can trust him. And out of that comes a life of stewardship, because it's interesting. Scripture says it's required of a person who has something entrusted to them to be found faithful, to be a steward of what's given to him, which means you govern over it not because you own it, but because he does. All right? The second thing is this, important for us to see, to treasure what perishes, or to put your hand on what rusts, what moths eat. It's the greatest act of foolishness you could ever make. In other words, if you start hanging on to something, I'm in pursuit right now trying to find something that somebody gave me 46 years ago. And I can't find it anywhere. I actually broke down this morning and finally asked Cindy, have you seen this? I'm looking for this. And her response is, no, I've not seen it, probably in 45 years. And I'm looking all over my house for it. And let me tell you why. A friend gave it to me many years ago, all right? And he entrusted to me this gift. Well, just in the last year, I ran into him and saw him after many years, and we were interacting. He said, and he looked at me saying, you still have what I gave you? Man, I hated that question, because I thought, I've got to find it. And so I've been in pursuit looking everywhere. Let me ask you a question. You ever lost something you really wanted to hang on to and you can't figure out where it is at all? I mean, so I'm in that journey of trying, okay, where is it? Now, how do you trace your steps back 45 years? I mean, we lived in X number of homes. We moved stuff in and out. I mean, we have a basement full of treasures that are down there that could be in some of those treasures. I don't know. But what I've discovered is this. I was looking for two treasures. All right? One of those my wife gave me about 35 years ago. I found it last night. I mean, I sat down at my desk and said, yes, the treasure has been found. All right? But then I said, well, what about the other treasure? I have no idea where it is. All right? So here's what James is saying to those who've been entrusted with the treasure. They have no idea who it came from. They have no idea what to do with it. And what he says is, you have a big problem. And that problem is that everything that you've entrusted yourself to has become an issue. Now, here's what's really interesting about this text. In no way does James say that you should live a life of poverty or you should release the things that have been entrusted to you. No, he says you should steward those the right way and not pursue things. So look back, if you would, in Luke chapter 12, just for a second, and look at one verse with me. I want you to see Jesus' words so you can understand, because I have had numerous friends throughout all the years who have been blessed by God in unique and powerful ways, and he entrusts that to them for a reason, because they can be good stewards. Listen in Luke chapter 12, verse 15. Then he said to them, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. All right? So what's Jesus say? Jesus says, don't get caught up with something you might have or not have. Instead, recognize that who brings it to you, the possession is not the key. The one who owns it is. And if Jesus owns everything, then it doesn't become an issue of challenge for us. All right, so think about this. James is wrapping his letter together. He's going to contrast next week what it means when you start praying the right way. Because, by the time you get to verse 12 of this text, he comes to this statement, let your yes be yes and your no be no, that you do not fall into judgment. All right? What's he saying there? What he's saying is you have to believe beyond anything that God has something in store for you, and you should say yes to it. Yes to it. And I could never forget when we were praying with Susan Hearn over her illness, I guess a couple years ago maybe. I only asked one question before we prayed and trusted that God was going to heal her. And what an amazing story of God's amazing healing in her body and life. But the question was, can your yes be yes? Because if you want the Lord to do something, you can't say yes, but if you don't mind, if you don't want to, it's okay. It'll work either way. No. You have to come to the place where you go, you know what? I'm going to believe that. I'm going to believe God just for that and watch what he does as a result of it. All right, so you see what Jesus said. Jesus makes it clear, be careful what's been entrusted to you. Now, let's move on to the faithful man's choices, all right, because this is really interesting because he begins to make these choices and to illustrate with these choices in ways that we can understand very easily that there's something here for us to take away from church today. So what have we learned so far? We've learned that Jesus wants us to steward our lives. He wants us to watch over our lives. He wants us to let God govern over every affair we have, every choice we make. And what does he say? If you don't, you can't take it with you. You can't take it with you. So be wise enough to steward it the right way. Then you come to what happens when you learn to be patient. All right? And so let's dive into this, and let's just kind of see how it unfolds. Because the faithful man makes the right choices. All right? And there are 4 choices that this text tells us that we should be willing to do. The first one is we ought to be patient. All right? Look, if you would, again at verse 7 and 8. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. You too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Do not complain. He goes on. He can start talking about the next thing we have to do in order to make the right choice. So the first thing he says is, I've got to be patient, all right? Which tells you something. You got to be willing to plant your seeds wisely, all right? The farmer does something that is very precise in order to make sure that he has the produce that comes from that. And it's interesting because when you look at this, it talks about patience, and you start, and the word patience there is stay with it no matter what, because it's going to come if you wait on it. Or just stay there and don't let it get caught up inside your mind going, I got to wait a little bit quicker, I got to go after this a little faster. And what happens is when you start getting patient, you begin to experience peace. Because one of the end products of a patient life is a peace that passes understanding. So listen, don't anticipate that everything in your life all aligns in one particular line for the rest of your life. No. There are going to be curves. There are going to be roads, and curves in the road of life. There are going to be challenges. But be willing to wait and be patient. All right? Choice number 2. Look at it if you would. Because in choice number 2, he talks about how important it is. In fact, when he talks about strengthening your heart in point 1 there, the idea of being willing to strengthen, verse 8, strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. What's he contrasting? He takes it from the ground to heaven. In other words, he said, strengthen your heart so that you can look up and see what it is God has for you. So today, as you think about your own life, process through in your own life and start processing through and say, wait a minute now. So I don't have to get caught up in seed that I planted 5 years ago. I get caught up in what I'm responsible for now, and I begin to sow that seed, and I begin to watch as God does something in me that I couldn't do in myself. All right? Because the farmer could walk around his farm all the time and go, okay, seed, I want you to start growing. Seed, I want you to start growing. And you don't change any of it. And what you discover is how important it is that you and I come to a place where we realize that it's God who brings the produce. It's God who brings the increase. It's God who works in it. Verse 9, you understand the second choice you have to make. Not just be patient, but be wise. Look, if you would, with me in verse 9, what he said. Do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that yourselves will you not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing right at the door. All right, so it's interesting what he says here. The person who complains is caught up in their own misery. And have you ever been around somebody who complains about everything? Whatever it is coming, complain about this, complain about that, and that complaining doesn't get you anywhere. And the person who does that, James said, you start complaining all the time, you're going to be judged. In other words, you make the big mistake of saying, I have the right to complain about this, I have the right to complain about that. And what he's really trying to get across to us is this: live understanding that God is watching. All right? Because if I know he's watching, then I am going to be more patient, more willing, more wise, more insightful, because I'm realizing, God has something in store for me that he wants to do inside of my life. And so today, as you think about that, he says, don't complain. Now, here's what I want to challenge you to do. Take a 7-day window and complain about nothing. It doesn't matter what it is, don't complain. If you go to a restaurant, they bring you the wrong thing, don't complain. If you find yourself, you may be like me. The other day I went to a gas pump, and there was if you scanned a barcode, you could save 5 cents a gallon. So I scanned it the first time, and the screen on the gas pump started just flashing all kinds of stuff. I thought, well, this is never going to work. And so I went to the next pump, scanned the barcode. Guess what happened? Started flashing again. I thought, well, either my barcode is bad on my card or I'm being taught patience. All right? And so I started watching everybody else around the gas station. They're getting their gas. And what's 5 cents a gallon? Well, it's a lot when you add it all up. So I finally got the third pump, and I scanned that barcode, and it worked just like it's supposed to. And while I was doing that, I was thinking to myself, if I complain, you ever been at a gas pump that says you can hit a button that says they'll help you, like help? They don't help. All right? They don't even care that your car doesn't work. And so I thought I'm just going to try every pump, hit the button, see if they'll just let me say this thing doesn't work. Guess what? They didn't care. They were drinking their Slurpee in the gas station, not caring a thing about what was going on with me. What you discover is there's a different kind of barcode that God writes on our hearts. And it is a code of conduct that keeps us from complaining because of what Jesus has done inside of us. All right? The third choice you make, the third choice the faithful man makes. Right? Remember, there's the wicked man who's making unwise choices, and then there's the faithful man. And the third choice he makes is to be willing to do whatever God has asked him to do. Look, if you would. Notice verse 10. As an example, brethren, of suffering and patience, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Take those prophets and start looking at them, and you realize something. All the prophets had to endure different things. All right, and you might write down Romans 15:4, just a reference point, because here's what you realize. All those who went before us lived through moments where they had to wait. Isaiah had to wait. Jeremiah had to wait. Daniel had to wait. I mean, all these different people, they had to wait. And what James does here is he says, if you are willing to endure for an eternal purpose, you're going to have a much richer life. And so what happens is you have all these things that start coming at you. And if you're not careful, they can steal your joy, steal your direction. And what happens is if you don't get back to Jesus and say, Lord, I want you to be in charge of me, then everything else comes apart. All right? And so you start enduring, say, you know what, I'm going to go through this. In fact, when he uses the word endurance there, he's talking about how important it is that we don't let up in what's coming at us, that we stay focused no matter what is transpiring, so that when we get through our journey, we're able to go, you know what, I endured that, and the Lord was with me. I endured this, and the Lord was with me. And what you discover is that endurance does something. It empowers you to be wiser at the point of waiting. Now, if you think about it for a second, waiting is one of the most challenging things we ever face. You wait for a raise, you wait for a compliment, you wait for an encouragement, you wait, and truth is, many of those things never happen, except on rare moments. And yet, that's not who you're looking for, the source of encouragement. What you're looking for is you learn to come to the place where you surrender ultimate outcomes to Jesus. In other words, you just come to a place, you know what? I'm not going to get caught up with that thought or this thought, and I'm going to zero in on what it is only Jesus can do. Because when I get there, something begins to happen. It's powerful. Now, choice number 4, be decisive. All right? Look at with me if you would, because here he illustrates about Job. Verse 11. We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job. You have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion, is merciful. But above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but your yes is to be yes and your no is to be no, so that you will not fall under judgment. All right? So what's very obvious is he uses somebody who endured a lot of difficulty, a lot of challenge. So let's take just a moment and let's kind of, first of all, recall the story. Job was a man who obviously lived in pursuit of God. So much so that the Satan chose to test him and push him into a test. And it's interesting for him. He had the trials from the adversary, but he also had the trials from his friends, because he had 3 friends that were a part of his trouble. So go back in the Old Testament just for a second to the book of Job, and because we can't miss understanding what James is doing here. James is saying the most patient guy on earth stayed with it. You and I can too. All right. So we direct our hearts to a very decisive and to decisiveness about how we live out our life. Now, look if you would in Job chapter 13. Job 13. What a great story of patience, all right? Look at verse 15. Notice what he said. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. So here's what he says to his friends and those who he's contended with. It doesn't matter what I go through. I'm keeping my eyes fixed on the one who owns my heart. But I'm also going to contend with him and ask him, help me understand why I have to go through this or I have to go through that. Remember, Job lost everything and God restored back to him more than he ever had before. All right? So look on over chapter 23. We're just glancing very quickly inside of a text. Job 23, verse 10. But he knows the way I take. When he has tried me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot is held fast to his path. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the command of his lips. And listen to what he says. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. Now, that sounds like a guy who's living out a patient life. That he's willing to go, you know what? I know that this way I'm taking, he's going to be with me. Chapter 42. Let's look at the end of the story. I want to show you a contrast in the story because I think it's interesting to know. Chapter 42, verse 1, or verse 2. I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. All right. He just lived through more than we could ever calculate and more storms than we could ever endure. And what does he say? Nobody thwarts God's purpose, which tells you something. Don't look for excuses. Look for encounters. Don't look and say, you know what, if this had not happened, no, look at when you say, Lord, I just want you to show me how I can become who you want me to be. Look for encounters in life. Look for moments where God teaches you. Look for moments where you learn how to commit to what truly matters in life. That's what he's saying here. And what happens is, I want you to see the contrast, though, to the people who chose to, throughout Job's enduring, challenging, waiting moments where God was going to work, he had 3 friends, none of which any of us would really want to have as friends, but he had them, okay? And they're a part of the story. Look, if you would, verse 7 of chapter 42. It came about, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz, that my wrath is kindled against you and against your 2 friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take yourself 7 bulls, 7 rams, go to my servant Job, offer a burnt offering for yourself, and my servant Job will pray for you. Isn't it interesting? And here are these friends who betrayed the trust of a relationship that was so key, which tells you something. If your friends let you down, pray for them. Don't judge them. That's what James is trying to say. Look on. For I will accept him so that I may not do with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And it goes on to talk about the 3 guys, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. They went and did exactly as the Lord told them, and out of that, the Lord accepted Job. All right, so what you discover is that here's this amazing story where he uses a farmer, he uses the prophets, and he uses Job to remind us all that we have to wait sometimes. And it could be you have to ask yourself this question: will you wait with a faithful heart? Will you wait for what it is God has for you? You want to read about endurance and patience? Read the book of Job. Read the story. Today we just snapshotted. What he said was, even if they slay me, even if it takes my life, I'm not taking my eyes off the one that I trust in. We ought to be the same way. He made it clear that those friends ultimately had to pay a price for what they said to him, because here's what they did to him. Every time Job had something go bad, they said, told you so. You should have lived in a different way. You should have made another choice. You should have forsaken what was there. And today, I want you to think about in your own life, as we wrap this together, what would happen in each one of our hearts and lives if we just today said, Lord, I choose to wait on you. I don't have all the answers. I know who the answer is. I don't intend to let accusations become a part of my story. I'm not going to get caught up in where I've been. I'm going to get caught up in where I'm supposed to go. Because, listen, the farmer didn't spend time 5 minutes thinking about the crop from the year before. The farmer said, man, we got to put this seed in the ground because now we have a chance to harvest something amazing. Listen, if your past steals your future, then Jesus can help you have a greater future. You just have to be willing to let go and let God have control. Because when you do, he begins to walk inside of your journey, and your story becomes so much more amazing. We started out with the story of someone who found Jesus in pursuit of them. I testified to it with you during the welcome time, and it's very intriguing to listen, because when Jesus starts knocking, he doesn't stop. When he starts pursuing, he doesn't stop. When he starts answering your prayer, he doesn't stop. He's there for you, and the Holy Spirit will work in each one of our hearts and lives to guide us that way. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for